In this video, I'm gonna make the case that Walter White from Breaking Bad has to be evil in every single way that you look at him. The main question proposed in this video is if Walter White can't be considered evil, then who can? To answer this question, we're gonna break down several of his actions to see if they actually are evil or not. I'll be comparing him to other characters as well. Let's get into it. The first aspect you should consider here is the bias in character perspectives. It's easy to root against Skyler, and a lot of people do, but this is only because we see things from Walter's point of view. From Skyler's perspective, you could easily frame Walter as the bad guy, even in season 1. This phenomenon can be pretty extreme, to the point where people see Walter as a hero and an explicit good guy for most of the series. For example, a lot of people give Skyler shit for cheating on Walt, but in reality it was completely justified. At that point in time, she wanted a divorce, but Walter wasn't having it, and they were definitely separated. If someone doesn't consent to being in a relationship, and then after they do stuff with another person, I wouldn't even consider it cheating, let alone it being wrong. Besides, Walter tries to make out with the principal the next day and sexually assaults her, which is worse than what Skyler did anyway. It got to the point even that Walt was just lying for lying's sakes, like when he went to the bar instead of getting diapers and lied about where he was when he had no reason to. This show really does manipulate your reasoning and judgment skills when it has you hating on a pregnant mom whose husband is selling hard drugs. All of these factors make Walter seem less evil than he actually is. But in a vacuum, without context, the things he does are absolutely terrible. Sexually assaults his wife, watching someone die, etc. Out of context, we would definitely call a person who did these things a monster. And this is what I mean by perspective. Even with the knowledge of all the things he's done, a lot of people just cut him slack, even if they think he's a bad person overall. This is one of the main problems for me in terms of disgust for Breaking Bad. We as a society are really forgiving to drug dealers. You won't see too many ethical arguments on why it's okay to deal, and dealing harsh drugs can destroy lives. But somehow Breaking Bad makes Walter seem completely justified in ruining people's lives by selling meth. And a lot of people support Walter's actions when a whole bunch of drug dealers in real life are doing it to support themselves or family as well. In real life, a person doing the same thing rarely would get the benefit of the doubt in this context. But drug dealers in real life have reasons and context for doing the things they do as well. And in fact, every single criminal on earth has reason and justification for doing whatever they did, or otherwise they wouldn't have done the crime in the first place. Don't get me wrong, some justifications are better than others, and some reasons for doing actions are completely illogical, but while having justifications doesn't necessarily make an action right or not, this is very important to consider still. Because why do some people think Walt is a good guy even up until season 4 or 5, when it can be argued he's a bad person just in season 1? It's because of his reasons or justifications, even if they're bad. But if Walter's justifications can stop him from dipping into the evil category, then why even have the word evil in the first place? Think about all of the actions Walter does throughout the series as a result of trying to protect his family. He murders, steals, lies, sells drugs. If you could do all these things without being evil, then the definition of evil, I would argue, is pointless in itself, at least when your reason for doing those things is flimsy, like in Walter's case. Because everyone has reasons for doing terrible things, but murdering someone for a bad reason is evil enough, especially in this case. Calling Walter a good or decent person just because we know his motivations even after he murders someone is just illogical. But I think it would be fair to assess Walter's actions in relation to his motivation to protect his family. Can Walter's actions be justified at all? At which point is Walter's actions irredeemable? Like other video essays have explained, Walter doesn't have to sell drugs. He was offered a job from Gray Matter where he could have essentially been rich. And if he asked, he probably could have established a trust fund for his family even after he died. Elliot was pretty much begging Walt to come back at this point, and he had a whole bunch of leveraging power. He really could have asked for anything he wanted. Besides even that, we have to call into question the ethics of selling drugs in the first place. One might argue that these people are deciding to do meth, which justifies Walter cooking, and this is the reason that Gale brings up when he talks about why he got into the business in the first place. But to put no blame on Walter for cooking wouldn't be right in my opinion. First of all, Walter condemns junkies and addicts and berates Jesse for being one all of the time, yet he's the leading reason why so many people are addicted to the substance in the first place, at least in his state. Walter sees the direct effects of his work multiple times throughout the show, but never thinks twice about the implications of his work. He even goes so far as to want to expand his brand internationally with Lydia. I think Walter's attitude towards selling meth can be summed up pretty well in his talk with Jesse. In that scene, Walter talks about how valuable it is to be the best at something, to which Jesse replies after literally cooking meth. This makes it pretty obvious that Walt hasn't even considered the negative effects of his product. Not to mention that this is also a case of exploitation. The strategy throughout Breaking Bad is to make extremely addictive substances and then charge people more for those substances. This is easily a case of exploitation since these people will be addicted to said substance. Walter obviously knows this and banks on it, glowing multiple times that his meth was extremely pure and therefore whoever's selling it would get more income from it. These two facts alone make it pretty bad that Walt is selling. Besides that, another controversial thing Walt does is lying. I personally don't think you could justifiably hate Skylar. She does some annoying things in season 3 onwards, but she's still pretty reasonable. To paint the picture here, your spouse starts obviously lying to you and leaving at random times during the day and night. At this point, you're probably justified in being a little bit paranoid, which is what happens to Skylar. The show just does a good job of skewing our perspective to make her seem like an obstacle towards Walt's goals. To which she is an obstacle, but I would argue that isn't a bad thing. And we could argue if she's a good wife all day, but Walter is definitely a terrible father and husband. Sure, he gives them the money in the end, but he puts them through a whole bunch of trauma, lies to them, and makes Skylar attempt suicide, all unnecessarily. Walter could have walked multiple times with Gus after Gus died, and before that even. All the events in season 5, hell, most of season 4 were completely unnecessary if Walt just didn't fuck up. I'd also argue that from an altruistic perspective, really none of Walt's actions are selfless, which I know some people try to argue for, especially for Jesse and the fact that Walter was doing this for his family. If getting money for his family was truly a selfless action, then he wouldn't care where it comes from. But we see him actively get frustrated when it comes through Junior's fundraiser. While it does seem that Walter cares for Jesse in a non-selfish way, I would argue the opposite. All the self-sacrificing things he does for Jesse are really just attempts to keep him in his life so Walt can treat him as his lapdog. Their relationship is special though, since Jesse was probably the first person in a while that Walter had complete control of. Not to mention the father-son aspect of the whole thing. This explains why Walter compulsively and constantly tries to work with Jesse over and over again, even when it disadvantages him. It simply just gives him a higher feeling of control. But all of this isn't in Jesse's benefit whatsoever. For instance, one could argue that Walter killing Jane was a selfless action so that Jesse could stop using and get his life back on track. But if letting Jane die was this virtuous thing that Walt did for Jesse at the sake of his own morality and sanity, then why would Walt let Jesse blame himself for months after her death? Jesse brings up to Walter multiple times that he's a terrible person for causing her death and he deserves anything that comes to him. Jesse being this distressed could have easily propelled him back into drug use or something even worse. Sure, Jesse was repulsed by drugs after this point because he thought he killed Jane, but there's no way that Walter knew that would happen. For all he knew, Jesse could have used drugs even more to cope with the death in the first place. So it seems more likely that Walt killed Jane just to get Jesse back, or he just killed her for some form of self-revenge. There are other reasons why Walter may have let her die, but I think these are the main ones. And yes, I consider this a murder. Not only was Walter the one to knock her on her back, he also knew they were high in the first place. But after that, deciding to not save her is definitely maliciously intentful. For instance, if you saw a kid drowning in a pond, and you were walking through a park, and you were able-bodied and able to swim, most people would say you're obligated to save the drowning kid. And this scene to me is no different. Probably worse, even because Walter is the reason why she was choking in the first place. It'd be like pushing the kid into the pond and watching them drown. But all this leads to another problem. Could there be any evil characters even in Breaking Bad if Walt isn't evil? Take a character like Gus, for example. You could argue his motivations and reasonings really aren't all that bad at all. He wants to avenge what most likely was his lover who was brutally murdered. The only reason I think Gus is seen as evil in this show is because he's the direct antagonist towards our main character, let alone the fact that Gus doesn't even get that much backstory in Breaking Bad. And this is definitely up to the power and bias of perspective. To further my point, guys like Jimmy and Mike, who would pretty much be scumbags in real life, are well liked by the community. I wouldn't think a lot of people would call them evil, especially with the context we have in both shows. This is why I have to say Walt is evil in pretty much any way you look at it, because if Walt isn't evil due to his motivations, even though his actions are terrible, then Gus isn't evil as well, nor Mike, nor Jimmy, even though they do some pretty bad and terrible things. It's just seen as differently with the context we have for why they commit the certain crimes they do in their thought processes. Also, if there's a context where Walt isn't evil, then really any criminal at all can't be considered evil, since once again, every person who commits a crime, or really does anything bad, has a reason for committing that action, right? Understanding the context of why someone does something doesn't absolve them of the evil actions that they do. And like I said at the start of the video, some reasons are better than others. But Walt's initial reasons for selling drugs and consequentially doing the rest of the things that he does are not good reasons, nor are they justifiable reasons at all. When you're offered a leading job at a billion-dollar company, you probably don't have to sell drugs to pay for your cancer treatment or leave money for your family behind. Even if you have to sell drugs for the long-term health of your family, it's probably not necessary to sell on an international scale and ruin thousands thousands, if not millions of people's lives for profit. I think this gives us an interesting take into why people do bad things. What are the factors and context when people commit certain crimes? And while yes, I understand that this is ultimately a TV show, that TV show can make us feel real emotions, and if it can get us to sympathize with crooks, thieves, and murderers, then why shouldn't we show the same empathy for petty criminals in real life? Well, if you guys like this video, please give me a subscribe. I know I've been inconsistent over the past couple months. That's simply because House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones content has been kind of dry. Trust me, once season 2 of House of the Dragon comes up again, I will definitely be making content super consistently. I'm gonna branch off a little bit for now though, so be in tune for those videos. All right, see ya.